Hello everyone, I'm Wave, and today I wanted to talk about multiple different love interests within visual novels, because for any visual novel that is focused around romance, even if it has multiple different character routes, there's a pretty good chance of it being where there's going to be one specific heroine, probably what I would call like the poster girl, or the character that is like the most prominent on the cover art for the game. Probably going to be the character that has the most spotlight. But there's been a couple different examples of visual novels that I've personally played where they kind of toy around with the thought of a like quote unquote main girl or main love interest and juggle maybe like two different main love interests and seeing how that kind of shapes the story. So I think one example, which would be one that people are most familiar with, would be Muv-Luv Extra, to where you have one character who's like the childhood friend and then one character that is like the new girl in town. And I think it's quite interesting that in like that case, you have it to where they purposely designed the route to where you could be very one-sided with your decision making, but at the same time you could also have a like sort of like conjoined route to where you can bounce in between both of the different love interests. And then at one point there's going to be an ultimatum that comes up to where after a certain point you have to like be given this choice to where you have to stop like playing with the hearts of both of those love interests and finally decide who is it that you're going to go to. And I do think that that's actually quite interesting, because in most other visual novels they might have it to where if there is like multiple heroines that you're making decisions for, there would be some sort of like point system that goes on in the background to where once you reach a certain threshold it's going to push you into one route over the other. So I was half expecting Muv-Luv to kind of go in that direction, but I think going off of the story itself and the fact that they are utilizing two quote-unquote main love interests, that they purposely designed the whole route around the fact that they're both balanced and that you could technically experience both within one playthrough, which I think was quite interesting. And then I think another example of a visual novel that I've been playing recently would be through the untranslated visual novel Mizuhiro, which I think also takes a really interesting approach to the multiple love interest dynamic, to where the way that it was designed within the original PC release of Mizuhiro was that you would have one route to where it is one main heroine and she's like the focus, and then you have another route to where we actually get to see both of them. And in a way you kind of do have that same dynamic as Muv-Luv Extra, where you're almost like bouncing between both heroines, but I think it's also done in a different manner, to where instead of maybe being exactly like that, you get to see one of the love interests sort of get downplayed and become maybe not jealous, but like beating themselves up on the inside for not being able to like express their feelings. And I think maybe because of the fact that I'm replaying Mizuhiro, I'm kind of seeing more of the like underlying tones and like the kinds of like themes that are hidden if you read in between the lines. But I think when I'm looking at Mizuhiro, it's kind of interesting too that between both of the different routes, I'm able to see like how they almost like parallel one another, to where one of the routes is going to be not tangible, if that makes sense, without me spoiling the actual like story of said route. And then the other route is a like physical, tangible kind of like story. Another parallel that I can see is maybe how on both of the different routes you have an object that is important. It's not like the exact same object, but it is the same type of object, and how you're able to use that as a piece that progresses the plot once you get far enough within either of the two character routes. And so I think like within Mizuhiro's case, I think it's quite interesting that you can have two main love interests, how like interwoven you can have both of those characters be within the plot, but at the same time, depending on like the choices that you make, you can have two vastly different experiences where the story just goes off in a completely different direction depending on which of those two love interests that you are leaning towards. And despite how vastly different the routes feel from one another, you can have these like subtle bits of story beats to where they end up sort of tying both together, and be able to see that both love interests were very much interwoven and connected, both like connections wise as far as like the two characters that are probably the closest to one another as being like best friends, and at that same time, despite the fact that maybe one of those routes is significantly shorter than the other, that you still feel like there was a same amount of impact between both of them, and that by playing both of them that you get this sense of like connectivity. But yeah, figured this would be an interesting topic to talk about because, like I said at the beginning of the video, I feel like there's a lot of visual novels where you can look at it and be like, oh, that's the quote-unquote main girl, just by looking at the cover and being like, okay, well, it heavily like dictates maybe like if you're someone like me to where you'll play all the different character routes and you'll like, if as long as you're not locked route progression wise, you might save the quote-unquote main girl as your last playthrough of the game because you're like, oh, well, this is obviously going to be the route that is like the most story heavy. So I think it's kind of interesting when you see the examples of the various visual novels that maybe play around with that idea and maybe subvert your expectations when it comes to like, oh, well, we have multiple different love interests. And while some visual novels might actually do it where I can think of another example of one that I finished reading recently, which was where they had 3 different main love interests, and how they balanced that was maybe just by having like one of the love interests be like a permanent character within all 3. But I think the visual novel examples to where they actually do heavily focus around that sort of like structure and make it to where you can have 2 different love interests and make it like a heavy theme within the story, I think is quite interesting, and I think is just quite entertaining to read. So yeah, I have been Wave. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.